This shot did not begin in that instant. It was planned. It was cultivated through years of hate against the American right. The trigger was only the final act of a story that had been written long before September 10th in Utah. But who really killed Charlie? What were the true motives behind the assassin? Did he plan it alone, or was he carrying out someone else's order? Was this the act of a fanatic, or the execution of a political message carefully orchestrated in the shadows? Who helped him disappear without leaving a trace? And why does the silence of the authorities feel heavier than the sound of the gunshot itself? These and other questions will be revealed in this investigation. For months, the killer had been preparing. He wasn't a man lost in confusion. He was methodical, deliberate, and obsessed. He had been radicalized in spaces where hatred of conservatives was not only tolerated, but celebrated. Every headline mocking, every broadcast demonizing, every politician framing the right as a threat, all of it became the justification for his mission. He believed he was not acting alone, but carrying the will of a culture that had painted conservatives as enemies to be erased. Weeks earlier he walked onto the campus of Utah Valley University, not as a student, but as a predator studying his ground. He marked the distances with precision, memorized entrances, exits, rooftops. His eyes fixed on the Losi Center, high enough to overlook the square where the conservative leader would soon stand. To him it was not just architecture, it was a sniper's nest. Later, in the privacy of his room, he sketched diagrams and calculations, rehearsing the path of the bullet that would silence a voice too loud for the left to tolerate. By the end of August his preparations were complete. He had tactical clothing, weapons broken into parts for easy transport, gloves, mask, and escape routes planned down to the minute. He trained his breathing until his pulse felt like clockwork. Every detail was stripped of hesitation. He wrote in his notes that this was not murder but justice, that the bullet would carry not his name, but the anger of millions who hated the right. September 10th arrived. Crowds filled the campus. For ordinary people it was a day of excitement, of speeches and hope. For him it was execution day. He arrived hours earlier, blending in, walking with the calm of someone who knew exactly where he needed to be. His backpack was heavy, not with books, but with parts of the weapon that would define the afternoon. He slipped inside, climbed the stairwell, and reached the rooftop. From above, he had the view he had dreamed of. A stage, a sea of supporters, flags rising in the air. The conservative voice he had come to destroy was there, amplified, celebrated. To him, each cheer from the crowd was another reason to pull the trigger. He assembled the rifle quickly, efficiently. Metal clicked into place, the scope aligned. He lay flat, steady, eyes narrowed to a circle of glass. The chants below rose louder, the figure on stage lifted his hand, the crowd roared. The killer inhaled, exhaled, and steadied himself. In his mind this was not a crime, it was a message. Not just against a man but against an entire movement. One finger tightened. The world shrank into silence. And then the sound that would rip through the nation thundered from the rooftop. The shot rang out like a crack of thunder that did not belong to the moment. For a heartbeat the crowd did not understand. People froze, caught between the sound of applause and the alien sharpness of the gunfire. Then the figure on stage faltered, the microphone slipping, the body jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. A scream tore through the gathering. And in an instant, celebration collapsed into panic. Students dove for the ground, parents pulled children close, security agents rushed forward but already knew the unthinkable had happened. The man on stage lay bleeding, his words cut off mid-sentence. People shouted his name, begged him to get up, but the sound of chaos drowned everything. It was not confusion to the man on the rooftop. It was confirmation. He had done exactly what he came to do. He didn't linger. The rifle was broken down in seconds, shoved back into his pack. He moved with the certainty of someone who had rehearsed it 100 times. Down the stairwell, boots hitting concrete in steady rhythm, mask pulled tight. In the distance alarms wailed, security radios burst alive with panic. He was gone before most of the crowd realized where the shot had come from. Witnesses would later describe the rooftop figure in fragments. Black clothing, a helmet, glasses, something tactical. But memory in terror is unreliable. All that mattered was that he had vanished, leaving only a hole in the chest of America's conservative movement and the echo of a single gunshot. On the ground, chaos spread like fire. Supporters screamed that it was an assassination, that the left had finally crossed the line. Others wept in shock, clinging to each other, unable to comprehend how one moment of hope could twist so violently into blood. Camera still rolled. Live streams captured every scream, every sob, every frantic order from guards dragging people to safety. Across the nation, millions would replay those seconds in disbelief. Emergency medics rushed the victim into a vehicle. His condition was critical. They tried to stabilize him, but the wound was too severe. Within minutes, the news began to filter out. He was gone. The conservative firebrand, silenced in front of his supporters, cut down not in a private corner but on an open stage under daylight. For the assassin, the escape had been carefully engineered. A car parked on a side street, engine running, waiting. Some witnesses swore another figure sat behind the wheel, unseen by most, while others insisted he fled alone. What is known is that by the time police cordoned off the campus, he was nowhere near the scene. He had vanished into the machinery of his plan. Authorities locked down Orem, helicopters slicing the sky, police searching rooftops, checkpoints rising on the highways. But the killer had anticipated the response. His routes had been drawn and redrawn until every second was mapped. By the time the first suspect descriptions aired on police radios, he was already out of the city. The FBI descended quickly, treating it as a political assassination with national implications. They questioned students, professors, event staff, piecing together fragments of a ghost. Security footage showed shadows moving through stairwells, a figure in dark clothing carrying a bag. But the images blurred, grainy, never enough to identify. It was as though he had scrubbed himself from the record. Commentators rushed to frame the story. Conservative voices declared war had been declared on them, that this was the price of speaking the truth. Left-leaning networks stumbled, some condemning the violence, others hinting that the rhetoric of the victim had provoked it. To the right, this sounded like justification and excuse for murder. The divide deepened by the hour. Behind the headlines, investigators followed the threads. The rifle had been high-caliber, military-grade, fired with precision from nearly 200 yards. Whoever pulled that trigger was no amateur. The rooftop was chosen with expert care. Elevation, distance, line of sight, and escape route all optimal. The killer had studied. He had trained. He had planned not just to kill but to escape and send a message. Agents began digging through online forums, tracing extremist chatter. They found posts drenched in venom against conservatives, threads fantasizing about silencing them permanently. Hidden among the noise were messages praising the act within hours of the shooting. To investigators, this was a chilling sign. The assassin was not alone in thought. He was one among many who had been fed the same poison. Supporters gathered in vigils that evening, holding candles, praying, swearing that his death would not be in vain. But under the grief simmered rage. Conservative America saw the hand of the left in every part of it. In the constant vilification of their leaders, in the way the media painted them as threats, in the silence of politicians who hesitated to condemn outright. The killer had pulled the trigger, yes. But who had loaded the weapon with years of hate? In the White House, statements were carefully crafted. Politicians demanded calm, called for unity, but the words rang hollow. The right heard no unity, only empty gestures from leaders who had watched their man vilified day after day. On talk shows, commentators admitted in lowered voices that this assassination would change the landscape of politics forever. Meanwhile, the killer watched the coverage from a safe distance. In his mind, the plan had worked exactly as intended. He had struck, escaped, and left the nation fractured. His name was unknown, but his message was everywhere. Each headline, each argument, each scream on television replayed the power of that single bullet. But the investigation was not over. Authorities would not stop. And as threads of his identity began to surface, whispers grew louder. He had not acted in a vacuum. His motives were tied directly to the culture of demonization, to the voices who painted the right as dangerous, to the speeches that normalized violence in the name of progress. The shot that killed a man had been fired by one hand. But the years of venom that made it possible were carried by many more. The nation was forced to ask itself a question that it was not ready to face. Was the assassin only one man, or the living embodiment of a movement that wanted to erase the conservative voice forever? The day after the shooting, the country was still reeling. News networks replayed the clip again and again, each angle showing the moment the shot broke through the air, each replay turning shock into obsession. But beneath the official headlines and cautious statements, theories had already begun to swirl. The narrative wasn't just about a single man with a rifle. It was about everything that had led to that moment. And the public, raw and restless, demanded answers. Investigators admitted they had little concrete information. A single shell casing, grainy footage of a shadow on a rooftop, eyewitness accounts too fractured to trust. But the lack of certainty only created more space for speculation. People wanted to know, who was he? Why did he do it? And above all, was this really the act of one man, or part of something larger? Some pointed to the months before the event, when the conservative leader had announced his tour. His speeches were sharp, unapologetic, directly challenging the mainstream narrative. To his supporters he was a beacon. To his enemies he was a threat. Online, activists on the left had ridiculed him, mocked his events, and in some cases openly wished for his silence. Theories spread quickly that the assassin had been radicalized by those voices, convinced that pulling the trigger was more than an act of violence, it was political duty. Others looked at the planning. The choice of location was not accidental. Utah Valley University, with its open campus and accessible rooftops, had weaknesses the killer exploited. Some speculated he had visited the site multiple times, blending in as a student, memorizing every path. The precision of the shot suggested training, perhaps military, perhaps paramilitary. If true, then this was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated strike. There were also whispers about coordination. Witnesses recalled seeing a car parked near the campus, engine running, moments after the chaos began. Some claimed they saw the figure slip inside and vanish. Was it an accomplice? A getaway driver? Or was that just panic turning strangers into suspects? Theories flooded online forums. That he hadn't acted alone, that he was part of a network determined to silence conservative voices. And then there were the darker theories, ones that blamed the very institutions meant to protect. Commentators suggested the killer had been emboldened by years of rhetoric that portrayed conservatives as dangers to democracy. They argued the media had painted a target on the back of the victim, making violence not just predictable but inevitable. In that telling, the assassin was not simply a lone figure. He was the product of an environment carefully engineered to despise the right. No one knew his name. No manifesto had surfaced. But people imagined his mind, hours spent online, drowning in forums that celebrated violence, feeding on words that said conservatives were a plague, a danger, a threat. They pictured him writing in a journal, convincing himself that he was chosen for something bigger. Theories filled in the blanks where facts had not yet emerged. The most haunting possibility was that the killer had left no trace because he had planned to disappear completely. Some claimed he was still in Utah, hiding in plain sight. Others believed he had been whisked away, protected by those who quietly approved of his mission. To the grieving supporters, this wasn't paranoia. It was the only explanation that fit the silence. By the end of the day, one truth remained clear. This wasn't just about a bullet. It was about the years of division that had loaded the chamber long before the trigger was pulled. Theories multiplied because people sensed that what happened on that rooftop could not be reduced to one man. It was a symptom of something larger, darker, and rooted deep in America's fractured soul. As night fell on the second day, the questions had only grown louder. The official line was that investigators were working around the clock, but the silence from authorities fed a storm of speculation. On social media, hashtags trended worldwide, each spinning a different version of the truth. Some claimed the killer had been a left-wing extremist acting alone, radicalized by endless streams of rhetoric. Others insisted the plan had been too clean, too precise, to belong to a lone fanatic. Theories began to weave threads of conspiracy, pointing to networks, organizations, and perhaps even shadowy backers. Reporters swarmed the Utah Valley campus, cameras fixed on the rooftop where the shot had been fired. Commentators noted how perfectly it had been chosen. From that height, the assassin had a clear line of sight, far enough to avoid immediate detection, close enough to guarantee accuracy. It wasn't the choice of a reckless amateur, it was tactical. And if the location was tactical, then the mind behind the trigger had been tactical as well. Conservative commentators replayed the weeks before the rally. They reminded viewers of the constant ridicule, the open hostility, the way left-leaning voices described the victim as dangerous, as toxic, as someone who needed to be shut down. Was it possible, they asked, that the assassin had absorbed this message until it became justification? Each time pundits and politicians painted conservatives as villains, the ground had been prepared. All that remained was someone willing to take action. On radio call-ins, listeners connected the dots. One caller said he had been on the forum where a user hinted about making history on the very day of the event. Another swore he saw men loitering near the parking lot with radios as if waiting for a signal. None of these accounts were verified, but together they painted a chilling picture. The killing had not been random. It was part of a deliberate, carefully orchestrated operation. Investigators admitted that the weapon used was uncommon, specialized, not something bought casually at a store. That detail alone fueled more theories. If the rifle was rare, how had the killer acquired it? Some speculated military connections. Others suggested political operatives supplied it. Theories turned darker. Claims that certain groups had long prepared for a chance like this, waiting for the right stage, the right figure, the right symbol. Meanwhile, the assassin remained invisible. No identity, no manifesto, no claim of responsibility. And yet his absence was a presence in itself. People imagined him somewhere in the country, watching the coverage, satisfied that one bullet had accomplished what countless debates had not. To conservatives, his silence was not mystery, it was confirmation that he had been protected, shielded, hidden by those who quietly approved of what he had done. Vigils continued across the nation. Crowds filled streets, chanting the victim's name, swearing that his message would not die. But even within those prayers was a rising anger. They demanded justice, but justice seemed elusive. Without answers, without a suspect, without motive spelled out, suspicion only deepened. Theories hardened into belief that the assassin had not acted alone, that he was part of something bigger, something built on years of political hatred against the right. Media outlets scrambled to control the narrative. Left-leaning commentators tried to frame the killing as the act of a disturbed man, tragic but isolated. Conservative outlets rejected that outright. To them, this wasn't isolation, it was escalation. They pointed to the climate of demonization, the constant portrayal of conservatives as enemies, and said plainly, the assassin was not just one man. He was the product of a culture. By the time the sun set again, America was no closer to knowing the name of the killer. But the shape of his motives, the long path leading to that rooftop, was being drawn in the minds of millions. And in those minds, the question was no longer if this was political. The question was how deep the politics went, and how many hands had guided the finger that pulled the trigger. By the morning after the shooting, the entire country was trapped in the same question. How could one bullet have been prepared with such precision? It was too clean, too deliberate, too professional. And so the focus shifted, not on the moment itself but on everything that had led up to it. People began retracing the weeks before the event. The rally in Utah had been announced publicly, giving anyone who wanted to prepare enough time. Was the assassin already watching from that very first announcement? Had he circled the date on his calendar, knowing this would be the day? Some argued that he must have visited the campus days in advance, disguised as a student, testing sightlines and planning an escape. Others believed he had chosen the location long before, scanning tour dates until he found the one venue most vulnerable to attack. Theories spread quickly about his background. The precision of the shot suggested training, perhaps military, perhaps law enforcement. But why would someone with that kind of experience choose this target? Supporters whispered that he had been pushed, radicalized by a culture that framed conservatives as enemies of democracy. The media had called them dangerous. Politicians had mocked them. Activists had demanded they be silenced. Could the killer have seen himself not as a criminal, but as an instrument of that rhetoric? Then came the darker suspicions, that he had not acted alone. Witnesses claimed a car waited nearby, engine running just as the panic began. Was it coincidence or was someone helping him escape? If he had backup, then this was no lone wolf, it was a coordinated strike. And if it was coordinated, who had given the order? Some pointed to fringe groups online, others to movements on the left that had openly celebrated when conservative figures were deplatformed. If words could erase someone's voice, what would stop actions from following? Investigators kept their statements vague. They confirmed a rifle had been used, that the shot came from a rooftop, but they refused to speculate on motive. Their silence was quickly filled by public imagination. Commentators said the killer had been emboldened by years of demonization. That the bullet was loaded not just with gunpowder, but with years of hate, amplified by every headline, every smear, every speech portraying conservatives as villains. For those mourning, it was impossible to believe this was chance. They believed the assassin had been groomed by the environment, guided by narratives that justified silencing the right. To them, this wasn't just a man pulling a trigger, it was the logical conclusion of years of political war. Theories multiplied because facts were scarce, but one truth united them all. The shot fired in Utah had not been born in a vacuum. It was the product of a nation where division had become fuel, and where words of hate had finally been transformed into action. And as vigils grew across the country, a new question echoed louder than the rest. If this is what one bullet could do, what comes next? Was this only the beginning of a darker chapter? Or could it become the moment when America finally faced the cost of its polarization? The truth is still hidden, but the warning is clear. Hatred does not stay in headlines forever. Sooner or later, it finds its way into someone's hands. If you believe this story must be told, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think truly happened before that shot? Was it a lone assassin acting out of obsession, or part of a larger plan fueled by years of division? Your voice matters because silence is exactly what those behind the bullet would want.